Well, that's an interesting question because I suppose depending upon where you are and what you think, you're going to have a different takeaway. My takeaways are fairly straightforward. Once again, I'm always stunned by the complete lack of any strategic coherence in anything that Donald Trump says or does. That makes him very entertaining. That's why he was successful as a reality TV star. But I think that creates havoc and uncertainty everywhere he goes. Perhaps that's something he likes and thinks he benefits from. So I was surprised that we went back to Greenland and the criticality of occupying Greenland to keep all those Chinese and Russian ships from somehow or another threatening the United States via Greenland and Europe. So hopefully everybody was just as disinterested in that as I think Georgia Maloney was. I was impressed with her level of complete contempt with which she treated Trump. A very wise move. Unfortunately, others were horribly sycophantic and far too interested in cultivating him. Other than that, I think it should be clear to people, even to the Israelis, who I don't think completely grasp this, that his decision to lift sanctions and provide the F-35 to the Turks is not aimed at Israel. I know the Israelis who are justifiably, I would add, very concerned with the threat from Turkey because it's quite real. Not at the moment, but that's something that they're going to have to live with if they survive this round. More important, I think Donald Trump is bribing Mr. Erdogan once again to stay on side, to leave the Israelis alone, to distance himself from Moscow, to reduce his cooperation with the Iranians, and quote unquote, be our friend, which really means do what we tell you to do. Now, the fact that he was able to turn these F-35s over to Erdogan may or may not guarantee any of that. Erdogan is innately Machiavellian. He'll move in whatever direction he thinks benefits him and his country. So be it. But I think for the moment, that's what Donald Trump wanted to achieve. And Donald Trump loves ceremony and loves to be celebrated. And I think the Turks did a marvelous job of providing him with all the trappings of power and glory that he could have ever wished for. Much better than anything he gets in the United States, incidentally. Now, beyond that, the Europeans, they were treated to the usual rhetoric because the man is a broken record in the sense that he just keeps repeating, you're not spending enough, you're not doing enough, and every time I deal with you, I'm frustrated, I feel I should withdraw, and so forth. This, in turn, feeds the European desire to find a way to drag the United States into direct military confrontation with Russia. And so all the emphasis on providing more money and more equipment and more nonsense to the Ukrainian regime, which admittedly is very much on its last legs, is part of this effort to drag us in. But it's not just a question of dragging us in, it's also a question of baiting President Putin. And this is something Europeans have tried now for, I would argue, for at least the last 3 years. But now it's gotten very serious. It is blatantly obvious that Lithuania, other countries that are in NATO, Finland, that border Russia, they're not only openly providing bases and even potentially nuclear weapons on their soil that may belong to us for potential use against Russia, they're effectively letting it be known that they're quite willing to cooperate with Ukraine in any way possible to facilitate harm to Russia. This is catastrophic. This is where President Trump, if he were genuinely interested in any sort of stability in Europe, would put his foot down immediately and say, that's out of the question. That's unacceptable. But he hasn't done that. In fact, what he did after much cajoling and private hustling is that he sat there and listened to Rubio, our Secretary of State, explain why it was so important at this phase, if we were going to make progress with negotiations to end the war, that we help the Ukrainians strike deep into Russian territory. If that wasn't enough, President Trump then had to intervene and say, yes, I think this is an escalation, but I think that's the path to success in negotiations and peace. I mean, incomprehensible. All of it reflects complete ignorance of the true situation in Europe and in Russia. But that's not really new. I mean, you have the most blatant amateurs that I think we've had, certainly since FDR. I mean, everybody tried to tell FDR over and over and over and over again. They did Churchill as well, and said, look, we're 100% for defeating the Nazis. We understand that. But there is no point in creating a situation that is beneficial to the Soviet menace. And they openly said, you can read this in the General Staff notes from the Imperial General Staff of the British Army. Stalin's communist Russia represents a far greater and more permanent threat than Nazi Germany. People tried to tell them these things over and over and over again. And what did we get back from FDR? I have a hunch. Uncle Joe's a good man, and we can work with him. After which, with all the information, the people around him, everyone from Harry Dexter White to Harry Hopkins and Felix Frankfurter and Henry Morgenthau, most of these are what we would call today Zionist globalists who are pro-communist, fed him a lot of nonsense, which he eagerly ingested and repeated. So we had no strategy for the Second World War. And when it became clear that we were finally going to enter Central Europe, that's when, of course, Churchill shows up, too late to the party, with no real voice anymore because he's now a vassal state of Greater America, and says, Ike, it would be good if we controlled Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. It would be useful if you took those right away. It was too late. And the rest is history. We all know the history. And people still were, World War II is great. No, it wasn't. It left us in a terrible state of conflict and hostility that lasted almost 50 years that we could have all done without. Then when it finally was, overcome, we couldn't wait to double down on it once again in the hopes of destroying this Russian state that had recently liberated itself from communism. So what do we have with Donald Trump in Istanbul? The same kind of ignorance, the same foolishness, demonstrating once again that he is most influenced, not just by the people around him, but those who talk to him just before he opens his mouth. Because if you'd have asked Trump some of these questions 2 weeks ago, I think he would have probably gotten a different answer. On more than one occasion, he says, I don't want to send any more money to Ukraine. I want the Europeans to deal with this. I want out. Well, how do you get out when you essentially step in and effectively take over, which is what he's done? This is, of course, music to the ears of the globalist cabal, Merz, Macron. I don't know how he's doing right now, but certainly Starmer and Starmer's successor, who is another Starmer in different clothing. So the whole thing, I think, was deeply disappointing. Now, there are others who were there who didn't say much. And they're the ones that we should look at very carefully. And I'm talking specifically about the Hungarians, the Croats. They're singularly disinterested in this war against Russia. The Slovaks, even the Poles. And if you look at the Poles recently and the return of the Order of the White Eagle by Zelensky to Poland, because they're sick of Ukrainians for a whole range of reasons. They're also disinterested in losing another 10,000 Polish soldiers in a war with Russia, which is what they did earlier. So he said, here's your white chicken. Take it. This is what Zelensky said to the Poles. And then they celebrated this Nazi Bandera and his friends who were not satisfied just to kill Jews. They wanted to kill Poles and killed over 100,000 of them. And this was celebrated in Ukraine. Insane. Makes no sense. So I think they are going to be more and more influential because Slovakia and Poland, Hungary, they border Russia. They border Ukraine. In other words, they have an interest in what happens there. And at some point, they're going to step up. But as far as we're concerned, everybody wants us involved. But if you're going to try and fight Russia, or if you're going to try and establish, I think, Trump notion that he was thinking about a no-fly zone over Ukraine. I mean, if he tries to do this, what are the Poles, Hungarians, and Slovaks going to do? What are the Romanians going to do? Are we going to start flying all of our sorties out of Sweden and Finland? Are we going to start flying them out of Denmark, Norway, England? I don't know if anybody's thinking about it, but that's insane. So I think the whole thing was a catastrophe, except for Donald personally. And he enjoyed himself immensely.
Yes, seemingly so. But what do you make of the shift by the United States, though? That is, all this talk, as you mentioned, about a no-fly zone. Again, perhaps it should.
I said, on one level, it's dangerous, very dangerous. You know, again, if you go back to Casablanca in January of 1943, this is where FDR suddenly announced his demand for unconditional surrender. And Churchill was shocked. And you could see the film, he sort of turns around and, well, what? We've never discussed that. Even Stalin, who is by no means a humanitarian, Stalin was smart enough to say, we think we should negotiate with these people. And we have contacts. And the Germans may be willing to come to some sort of a negotiated end to this. Why are you doing this? Well, FDR decided. He decided in isolation. He decided it looked and sounded good. And somebody said, well, where'd you get this? And there was some confusion. Somebody said, well, U.S. Grant during the American Civil War. True American, unconditional surrender. Why am I bringing that up? Because that's Donald Trump. It's off the top of his head. Oh, I thought this was a good idea. Now, what do you do if you're a Russian? That's the question. And I think the Russians are taking all of this very seriously. And what have we continually done poorly? We have always misjudged Moscow. We have always dismissed them out of hand. We grossly underestimated them from day one. And even now, we continue to effectively dismiss them out of hand militarily. Now, how one could do that at this stage is incomprehensible. But Glenn, I'm sure you've seen it. I see it all the time here in Washington. Ugh, Russians, they won't do anything. See, it's the idea that you poke the cobra, and you poke the cobra. The cobra sits there but doesn't strike. See, he won't strike. And you poke the cobra. And eventually, what does the cobra do? He strikes. You die. That's what we don't get. That's where we're headed. That's what we're pushing for. The other thing I think is that there's a tendency on the American side to bloviate a great deal, to talk out of turn, to make promises we can't keep. And, when all else fails, we bully people. You cannot bully the Russians. You cannot bully the Iranians. You cannot bully the Chinese. Forget it. It's over. It's done. So what do you hope to achieve? I think we're losing a lot of support in the Gulf as well as in Europe from a lot of people. It's not popularly appreciated or known here in the United States, but it's real. I think that's only going to get worse. So I'm afraid I think it's very dangerous. But I don't think President Trump has any idea how dangerous his statements are and how foolish he looks in front of the world and how easily he's being manipulated by the wrong people, whether it's the Israelis or the Europeans, it doesn't matter. Some inkling of it in Germany. My experience with most Germans is that they're very unhappy with the government in Berlin. They don't support all-out war against Russia. They're much more concerned about the wave of criminality that has come into the country since 2015, thanks to all of these non-Europeans they have. They would like to rid themselves of that problem. Beyond that, I can't say too much. We know that Germany, and I would argue Great Britain as well, we could say that to some extent about ourselves, is deindustrialized. So they're on the verge of economic collapse. The financial system won't support them much longer. And people say, well, how can you say that? Well, all you have to do is look at the numbers of people that can't find work in Germany. Look at the numbers of people who are officially on the dole, who are dependent entirely on checks from the government. I include in that number vast numbers of these unwanted migrants. Same thing is true in Great Britain. What does war always breed? War breeds inflation. And right now, in order to cope, what are we doing? Well, we're raising interest rates. We have no choice. We really don't control them anymore. And if you look at the 10-year bond in the United States, which is very, very important, everybody, if you bring on anybody who's an expert in the bond market, whether it's somebody like Guntlock or Luke Roman or any number of people, and look at oil, inflation, and the bond market for the interest rates. Oil has already inched up to almost $80 a barrel now that the straits are shut down again. They're going to remain shut down for some period of time. I don't know how long that is. People think that we're going to be on a yo-yo. Pause this week, war next week, pause the following week, war the next week, so forth. The markets can't cope with that. And eventually, all of the efforts undertaken by the financial gurus that surround Trump, his friends and billionaires in New York City, to suppress the cost of oil by shorting oil repeatedly, exploiting all these public statements at the right point in time, that's going to fail. It's not going to work anymore. And when that does, if you look at the bond market today, the 10-year bond is up to something in the neighborhood of 4.5 or higher. Everyone I know tells me the same thing, and I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think you have to be to figure this out. When that 10-year bond rate, interest rate, hits 5%, we're through. We cannot service the debt. We cannot borrow any longer. The destruction of credit, which is inevitable at that point, is going to bring everybody in the West down. And that's where we're headed right now. A lot of people, including me, I thought Trump understood the danger, which is why I thought he made an intelligent statement when he signed the MOU. Everybody knows that that MOU is anathema to Donald Trump and his administration and to everybody in Washington. It's essentially an admission that we are not the hegemonic power. That's your point. We've surrendered. Everybody says, well, it's a surrender document. Well, what we've said is we're not the hegemon anymore. And that's perfectly fine with me and most Americans because we don't want to spend the money on that nonsense. It's unnecessary. We don't have to be the hegemon. We have to defend ourselves and our true interests. But that's not the attitude in Washington. So I think we're going to hit that wall. We're going to hit that 5%. It's going to break, and then we're going to be in free fall. That's going to bring everything to a screeching halt. Now, when does that happen? I don't know. It could happen next month. It could happen at Christmas. It could happen in October. But I think we're headed there. I don't see how you stop it. The Europeans, I think, don't believe that. I think they believe that somehow or another magically we can rig the system and carry on with this enormous debt load. I don't think so. I think the British, I used to think it would be the French, but I'm beginning to think the British are the first to go under. You have to look at their gilt market. They have similar problems. They almost went under Liz Truss. Everybody since Liz Truss has essentially been putting Band-Aids on the economy and on the financial system. That's not going to last much longer. Britain is very close to open warfare in the streets. I mean, you can only tolerate Pakistani rape gangs and other thuggish elements in your unwanted migrant population from hunting British citizens who are not armed until finally somebody says enough's enough. So I think bad things are coming. The other thing is this overlaps with not just economic disappointment, but with a very serious class war. And I think that's true in much of Europe because the globalist elites, they're largely out of touch with the majority of people in the population. They don't care. If you listen to people like David Betts, he'll tell you that the people in Parliament don't understand the world just 20 kilometers away. They have no idea what's going on. I think that's more and more the case in Paris. You have this sort of bureaucratic, parasitic class that sustains itself and thinks that life will go on regardless. And they don't care what happens to the population as long as they get to hold their position of authority and get their paycheck. In the United States, it's all the people that are invested in pension funds, which we're borrowing against at a very high rate. And those people are going to lose everything. That's my generation. These are the so-called boomers that have been paying into these things for years. All of this is going to happen. That is finally going to change everything. But in the meantime, the danger is the stupid remarks we're making about the things that we really cannot do, and if we try, we'll fail, are essentially a bait for the Russians. We're baiting them. Prove that you're serious. Prove that you can do this. And the one thing I would give President Putin great credit for is that he's avoided taking the bait. And he is progressing. I mean, I sat down the other day with someone who's experienced in these Russian matters and understands the military and the problems they have. All militaries have problems, by the way, and the Russians have theirs. But along the forward line of troops, that continues to advance westward. There's no question about that. It's slow because if it were not for these thousands of drones that have to be dealt with, I think things would be over in a few days. But when you finally create a cauldron and you surround it, it takes 2 weeks to reduce it, to destroy the people that are in there, and then move in, and then you move forward. But they're getting closer and closer and closer to the edge. But the drone is an irritant. It is not the strategic game changer that people in the West think it is. It's a serious strategic irritant to Moscow. It's their public is furious over it. The Russian people are sick of it. And so when Peskov comes out and says, effectively, the SMO is over, war is now, and this is not really new because we've been listening to many people, including Sergei Lavrov, say we're already in World War III.